In April 1945, the American army was advancing through German-occupied territory. Hitler's men were in chaotic retreat. Just a few days later, on the 8th of May, the Reich was to unconditionally surrender to the Allied forces. As they advanced towards Berlin, the GIs crossed a country flattened by air raids and met with an exhausted population. Yet what they didn't know was that, beyond the destruction of war, they were about to discover the unimaginable. It was a reality which would forever leave its mark on General Eisenhower. It was the 12th of April 1945, and the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces had come in person to visit the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Germany. He would never be able to forget what he saw.
C'est la sidération et le choc. Il y a une trentaine de corps qui ont été laissés dehors à l'air libre. L'odeur est pestilentielle, il y a des charniers. Donc il y a quelque chose qui est au-delà de ce que l'on peut imaginer.
A few days later, in a letter to one of his generals, Eisenhower wrote, "The things I saw beggar belief. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality was so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick." Camp after camp, photographers and journalists were invited to come and witness the reality.
It was very hard for people to believe such atrocities.
Some reporters were in a state of shock.
These are the foul, wretched remnants of human beings like you and me.
The entire world beheld the proof of the worst ever crime against humanity. Tons of heaped up clothing, mountains of shoes, thousands of hastily fastened suitcases for a one-way journey. Everything highlighted the scale of the massacre. This footage provoked shockwaves. Yet was this discovery really a surprise for the Allies? Could Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, or even Charles de Gaulle have been unaware that for 4 years Hitler had been coordinating the extermination of Jews? Did they really do everything within their power to ensure that the Nazi war criminals be brought to justice? These questions raise points which had long been avoided. They bear on one of the greatest taboos of the Second World War. This is the very story we are going to tell you. The Allies knew what was really happening in the camps much earlier than one might imagine. Warsaw, Poland, in midsummer 1940. At the heart of the Nazi-occupied capital, in one of its buildings, a top-secret meeting was being held. The leaders of the Polish resistance were on alert as the situation was critical. For several weeks, the Germans had been eradicating their networks. Thousands of political opponents had been captured and sent in convoys to a camp situated 300 kilometers to the south of Warsaw, a camp which bore the name Auschwitz.
Wiadomo, że to jest obóz, ale jaki charakter ma mieć ten obóz, nie wiadomo.
A camp with extremely harsh prison conditions, where the prisoners were apparently particularly badly treated. The leaders of the armed struggle were concerned about those of their men imprisoned there.
I pojawiały się różne sugestie, jak do nich dotrzeć, jak z nimi nawiązać kontakt, dowiedzieć się, co się z nimi dzieje.
Among the resistance was a certain Witold Pilecki. While a state of indecision prevailed around the table, he had an idea, an insane idea, to be purposely arrested and deported to Auschwitz. And once inside, to meet with their men and organize an uprising, a mutiny.
Pilecki, effectivement, a demandé de se voir octroyer cette mission, d'être enfermé dans le camp d'Auschwitz pour y organiser l'insurrection générale et donc la libération de ses camarades enfermés là-bas.
The mission seemed completely mad. Yet for this patriot, it was the only way of saving his fellow men. Here is how he would go about it. Pilecki knew which district the Germans would soon be targeting. He managed to locate himself there and waited for the next wave of arrests. A few days later, in the early morning, his strategy worked. The Nazis had the neighborhood surrounded. They entered his building at number 40 Wojska Polskiego. They climbed the stairs to apartment number 7. 75 years later, we spoke to Witold Pilecki's daughter. Zofia is now 82 and she has forgotten nothing.
Nawet tylko się zapytał, czy jest ktoś z mężczyzn, a wujenka nie zdążyła odpowiedzieć nawet na to pytanie, bo wyszedł zza drzwi.
As he expected, Witold Pilecki was arrested and deported. On the 21st of September 1940, after 24 hours crammed into a convoy of cattle wagons with hundreds of others, he arrived at the camp and entered another world. Above the doors of the camp, he discovered a motto: Arbeit macht frei. Work brings freedom. In autumn 1940, Auschwitz was still a small concentration camp. The deportees, mainly Polish prisoners, were condemned to forced labor. There were 1,800 of them, placed under high surveillance, surrounded by watchtowers, and cut off from the outside world by miles and miles of barbed wire. From that moment onwards, Pilecki the infiltrator became number 4859 and discovered with great stupefaction the life of the deportees.
Jako nauczycielka, więc musiała być odpowiednio wcześniej przyjechać do szkoły i tak dalej. I ojciec nigdy nie narzucał nam, pytał się, ile chcecie owsianki, żeby nalać do talerza. A ta owsianka to mnie już też, wie pani, wychodziła z...
Very quickly, Pilecki realized that in this place you were worked to death because Auschwitz was a permanent work site. The workers were no other than the prisoners themselves, a labor force reduced to slavery. And when, as Pilecki witnessed, one didn't die of hunger or from the cold, one could become the arbitrary target of the SS. Each day, summary executions took place at the end of an alley against a wall known as the execution wall.
Le camp de concentration, c'est le règne de l'arbitraire, même s'il y a un règlement, le règne de la terreur et le règne de la loi du plus fort.
And what particularly shocked Pilecki was the fact that in this camp there was a population which was even more greatly mistreated than the others. A population which in 1940 was still a minority, but that the SS singled out as their prime target. These were the Jews.
Les déportés juifs d'un camp de concentration sont destinés aux tâches les plus dures, ont des conditions de vie encore plus difficiles que les autres, bref, sont de toute façon d'ores et déjà traités différemment.
It was this system of generalized terror that caused this Polish resistance member to change his plans. His priority was to let the outside world know what was happening in Auschwitz. And so he set about establishing a form of resistance network among the prisoners.
Il va choisir des hommes qu'il connaît de l'extérieur, c'est-à-dire des membres de la résistance polonaise et des gens qu'il a côtoyés par ailleurs avant son entrée à Auschwitz.
Yet to let the outside world know what was happening, it would be necessary to get out of the camp, and in theory, escaping from Auschwitz was impossible. The camp was an absolute fortress. The prisoners' unit was under close SS surveillance, surrounded by a double barbed wire fence, together with a series of watchtowers, and enclosed within a concrete wall. It was a place from which escape was not possible. Yet Pilecki found a way of attempting to escape, thanks to his fellow prisoners who were prepared to take any risk. Among them was Kazimierz Pieczowski. He was just 19 at the time, and he set about elaborating a spectacular escape. Together with two accomplices, they presented Pilecki with their plan whilst walking together one Sunday.
Nawet w pracy, to udawał, że tam but mu tam coś takiego, albo tam to sznurowadło pękło. On udaje, że tam coś przy bucie robi, a mówi, a przekazuje. Nie? Także bali się.
This dangerous mission had very little chance of success, but Pilecki encouraged them. While he himself wanted to remain in the camp to witness what was going on, Kazimier's escape would be a way of informing the outside world.
Poszedł do niego Staszek Jaster. Przedstawił mu naszą ucieczkę. Taka ucieczka, która z góry było wiadomo, że się nie uda.
By way of precaution, Pilecki didn't wish to give them a written document. And so he made one of Kazimier's companions learn the message by heart.
On mu to napisał, dokładnie wszystko. Potem powiedział, przeczytaj to 10 razy. Jak to? Przeczytaj to 10 razy. Staszek przeczytał 10 razy. Możesz już bez czytania powiedzieć, co tam jest napisane. Możesz. No więc to, co możesz, masz w głowie, to jest twój raport. Tu, a nie tu.
At midday, at lunchtime, Kazimierz and his 3 fellow prisoners put their plan into action. The 4 of them left their barrack, behaving as if everything were normal, and made their way to the far end of the camp, to where the Nazi quarters lay. Here they split into 2 groups. Kazimierz and 2 accomplices made their way to the warehouse, where the SS uniforms were kept.
Pour ce faire, ils avaient préparé leur intrusion en ouvrant l'une des réserves de charbon, en laissant ouverte une trappe de la réserve de charbon, ce qui fait que par cette réserve en sous-sol, ils ont pu pénétrer de l'intérieur dans l'entrepôt de la SS. Il leur a fallu ensuite monter au 2e étage où se trouvait la chambre des uniformes SS.
Kazimierz broke the lock, entered the warehouse, and took 4 uniforms. In the meantime, the 4th member of the group, the mechanic, managed to get inside the SS garage.
Nie, tu poszło wszystko innym torem. Mianowicie takim, że mój kolega, który pracował w tej samej komandzie pracy, on był mechanikiem samochodowym tak dobrym, że jak SS-mani nie mogli naprawić jakiegoś samochodu.
The man climbed behind the wheel of the camp commander's Steyr 220, a powerful enough vehicle to ensure that the escape be successful. The 3 false SS officers joined him in order to move on to the most delicate stage of the operation, crossing the SS-guarded main gate.
Ils avançaient et puis à la toute fin, semble-t-il, puisque les grilles ne se sont pas ouvertes, eh bien, Pirowski dit y être allé au culot. Il affirme avoir insulté les SS pour leur dire de se dépêcher d'ouvrir les grilles, parce qu'ils n'avaient pas que ça à faire. Et donc, ils ont obéi, ils ont ouvert les grilles.
Kazimierz and his 3 fellow prisoners had managed the unthinkable, an escape from Auschwitz in broad daylight, and with supreme irony, having the gates opened for them by their captors. Within minutes, they were far away. It was from this moment onwards that Pilecki's message embarked on an incredible journey. After being delivered to the Polish resistance, it traveled across Germany to France's free zone, crossed the border into Spain, and finally proceeded across the sea to Great Britain. In London, the Polish government in exile was in permanent contact with the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. The British authorities received in this way 8 messages which Witold Pilecki passed on to them by various means.
Że te meldunki Pileckiego z obozu docierały, a mamy takie dowody, docierały do Londynu i do aliantów, to jest właśnie jakby ten największy dowód uznania dla jego pracy, dla tej misji, którą w obozie wykonywał.
The first of Pilecki's messages arrived in London in March 1941. Its content provided an unheard-of account of the living conditions within the camp. The resistant fighter and volunteer infiltrator gave accounts of humiliation, beatings, insufficient food. As for the SS, he described them as executioners. From one message to the next, the British learned that the Nazi concentration camp system was methodically slaughtering men, and that was only the beginning. The Allies were rapidly to discover that Nazi cruelty was taking on proportions never seen before. In midsummer 1941, Winston Churchill received a confidential and alarming file on his desk, bearing the words, "To be kept under lock and key, never to leave this office." This information had been issued by the British Secret Service. It concerned radio messages from the German army, which had been intercepted. According to these messages, the Nazis had for several months been carrying out large-scale massacres on the Eastern Front against the Jews. Slaughter of Jews is again reported in messages of 27/8/41. Or, the Police Battalion 302 claims to have shot 4,200 Jews without loss to themselves.
SS and police leaders were reporting the shooting of 3,000 Jews here, 4,000 Jews there, a pattern of shooting of Jews and communist officials.
The number of reports on the desk began to grow. The British Prime Minister was brought to realize the terrible reality. As they progressed through Soviet territories, the Nazis increasingly arrested and executed the Jewish population. This was later to be called the Holocaust by bullets, with more than 1 million victims. Churchill decided to act. He delivered a speech on the BBC radio. It was the 24th of August 1941, and the British Prime Minister had already issued an alert.
Since the Mongol invasions of Europe in the 16th century, there has never been methodical, merciless butchery on such a scale. And this is but the beginning. We are in the presence of a crime without a name.
A crime without a name. Strong words, and a message heard throughout the West. However, Churchill's cry of alarm met with little response.
Qu'est-ce qu'il pouvait faire? Qu'est-ce qu'il pouvait faire pour des événements qui se déroulaient à des milliers de kilomètres, alors que toute l'Europe occidentale était occupée? Donc c'est aussi un espèce de raccourci mental incroyable, qui est de dire, puisqu'on sait, on peut faire quelque chose, mais ils ne peuvent rigoureusement rien faire.
It has to be said that in 1941, Churchill was alone in Europe. To the West, almost all governments had surrendered to the Nazi regime. And to the East, Stalin and the Russian troops had just been invaded by the Germans. As for the USA, they hadn't yet entered the war. Churchill's alarm signal went therefore largely unheard. And what he didn't yet know was that Hitler was in utmost secrecy making arrangements for the most irrational of plans, a crime which surpassed all reason. On the 20th of January 1942, to the south of Berlin, in the small town of Wannsee, 15 senior officials of the Third Reich held a secret meeting in a stylish villa. Their goal was to establish together the practical aspects of the top secret program.
Pour pouvoir déporter et assassiner les Juifs, il faut pratiquement que toutes les administrations nazies mettent la main à la pâte. Et ça, c'est Wannsee.
For 2 hours, they discussed logistics with the sole objective of eliminating all Jews from Europe. To do so, they identified them country by country. 11 million people in total. Next, they put into place measures for their arrest and transportation to the places of extermination. For what they wanted was to speed up the process. Among the participants was the overzealous Adolf Eichmann, one of the senior officials responsible for Jewish affairs within the Nazi regime.
Adolf Eichmann rédige ensuite le compte-rendu de la réunion. Ils fument des cigares, ils boivent du cognac, et c'est une réunion normale.
Nevertheless, precautions were taken. Not once were words like kill, assassinate, or exterminate employed. Instead, they favored a more abstract expression. Die Endlösung der Judenfrage. Literally, the final solution to the Jewish question. Their plan had to remain confidential at all costs.
Ils ont très probablement conscience qu'ils transgressent quelque chose et que cette transgression, c'est-à-dire l'assassinat d'hommes, de vieillards, de femmes, d'enfants, de bébés, c'est quelque chose qui n'est pas admissible.
In theory, only Hitler and his close circle were aware of it. Yet information was to be leaked, and it was a man from within the ranks of the Third Reich who passed it on to the Allies. This man played a major role, and yet his identity is one of the greatest secrets of our time. To solve the mystery, we had to go to the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. This is where we met those who helped us discover the name of the unknown man. Two historians, Walter Laqueur and Richard Breitman. Two renowned university professors who conducted their own investigation.
I think he was far more important than Schindler, because all Schindler did was, well, a great thing, to save a few hundred, a few thousand people, whereas what Schulte tried was to help to save millions. He was an ignored hero.
What allowed them to trace the man in question was this document, a telegram dated 29th of August 1942. It's addressed to the World Jewish Congress in New York and revealed the Nazi project. Received alarming report that in Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration, all Jews in countries occupied or controlled Germany number 3.5 to 4 million. The telegram had been sent anonymously and only a few words make reference to the sender, an informer known to be close to the top German authorities and whose reports are considered to be reliable. Stated to have close connections with highest German authorities and his reports generally reliable. Nobody in the United States, not even the administration's highest ranks, knew the true identity of this person.
This was the biggest secret of the Holocaust.
The two American historians, Walter Laqueur and Richard Breitman, only succeeded in solving the enigma of the mystery informer after years of research.
It was exhilarating. It was the most challenging thing I've ever done in research, and it was probably the greatest satisfaction I've ever had in my research.
It's an incredible story, which began in Germany, in Silesia, in the town of Breslau. It was here that the man who would betray Hitler was to be found. His name was Eduard Schulte. Schulte belonged to the upper class. He was married with 2 sons. He spent his weekends hunting in the forest and his evenings in the company of the region's upper crust. He owed his wealth to his factories. He was at the head of one of the greatest mining companies in Germany. He employed over 30,000 people. His company produced zinc, a necessary material in the production of ammunitions, a key industry during wartime. This was why he came into regular contact with the Nazi regime.
He belonged certainly to a small group of very important people. He must have known the officials. He didn't meet them every day, but he must have taken part in some important meetings.
We found a man who remembers Eduard Schulte well. It's his grandson, Roy.
My grandfather was a very big man. He was tall, and he was athletic and healthy. And when he walked into a room, he was noticed. He was a confident man. He was an extrovert. He knew many, many people. So he liked to talk and liked to deal with things.
Eduard Schulte was putting on an act. For in reality, he hated the Nazi regime. He hated Adolf Hitler. He wished to see only one thing, the fall of the Third Reich.
He thought they were gangsters. He thought they were going to wreck Germany.
Schulte had Jewish friends whom he saw secretly. He had one particularly close relationship which, in the given context, could have cost him a great deal.
My grandfather had a mistress in Zurich while his wife was living in Germany. And the mistress was Jewish.
Doris. Doris was a passion he pursued in the most utmost secrecy, for were the Nazis to learn of it, they would both be in great danger. So in the name of his political convictions, Eduard Schulte became an undercover informer to the Allied services. Whenever he had the opportunity, he passed on strategic information to London and Washington. It was in this way that he revealed the most criminal of Nazi plans to the Americans. This is how it happened. In his company, he employed a certain Otto Pfitzner, who was a well-placed man in Nazi circles, and, without his knowing it, Schulte obtained precious information from him.
No one, especially Pfitzner, knew that Schulte hated the Nazis. In fact, Schulte encouraged Pfitzner, you want to serve on this Nazi advisory board on the war economy? Go ahead, that'll be good for our corporation.
Pfitzner boasted about having access to very valuable information. Hence, in July 1942, in the presence of his employer, he admitted hearing about a top-secret decision that came directly from Hitler's HQ. Schulte was to skillfully manipulate him in order to learn more.
Schulte may have said, oh, you don't really know what's going on in Hitler's headquarters, and Pfitzner said probably something like, oh, yes, I do. You want an example? Here's what Hitler's headquarters is considering now, a plan to kill 3.5 to 4 million Jews.
A scheme for the extermination of up to 4 million Jews. The information was difficult to believe, but Eduard Schulte instantly understood that this decision had no historical precedent.
One can imagine that anyone, given the information that 3.5 to 4 million innocent people are about to be killed, would feel tremendous pressure. What can I do? What should I do? What is safe for me to do?
Schulte decided to inform the Allied forces in an attempt to avoid the massacre of millions of innocent people.
As soon as he learned this, he got on the train and went to Zurich with that information. And he had very specific information. He had dates and he had places and means. He knew that they were going to use this acid to create gas to kill people.
On the 29th of July, 1942, Schulte took advantage of one of his regular business trips. He took the opportunity to travel across Europe and enter the neutral territory of Switzerland. Not wanting to draw any attention to himself, he did nothing that wasn't in keeping with his usual habits. In Zurich, he spent the evening with Doris, his mistress, but remained silent about the real reason for his visit. The following day, however, he slipped away for a very private appointment. Officially, it was a business appointment, but in reality, it was a meeting with one of his Jewish acquaintances, an important banker in whom he fully trusted and who possessed transatlantic connections. Before delivering his dreadful message, he laid down a condition.
He told him, look, I'm going to tell you something, but I want your word of honor that my name will never be published.
The banker swore to keep his identity a secret, and so Schulte delivered his information.
Well, he told him that there had been a decision to kill all European Jews, and beginning immediately, and gas was used, and that this horrible action had begun and was proceeding.
It was in this way that the famous telegram was sent to New York and arrived in the office of the American representative for the World Jewish Congress, Rabbi Stephen Wise. On the 24th of November 1942, Stephen Wise invited the American media to attend a large press conference. The rabbi announced to a panel of journalists that the Nazis were deporting large number of Jews to Poland for the purpose of mass extermination. It was the first time that such information was made public. The problem, however, was that this failed to provoke the media frenzy that Eduard Schulte had hoped for. The next day, the New York Times ran a headline on the latest developments from the Eastern Front and Stalingrad. To read Schulte's explosive information, you had to turn to page 10. Inserted between two photographs, the information appeared as a simple dispatch. It consisted of 5 short, factual paragraphs which indicated that an extermination campaign was taking place in Nazi-occupied European countries. In fact, the information seemed so stupefying that nobody thought it credible.
There were plenty of people who still thought this was fantastic. This was so exaggerated that Jewish organizations must be exaggerating for their own reasons. They found it difficult to think that human beings could do this to other human beings.
By now, however, the information had been made public. The Allied governments could no longer ignore it, and all the more so since the evidence was growing. The Allies received further information which matched Schulte's, namely in the form of a report from another member of the Polish resistance, Jan Karski, who also confirmed in November 1942 that a Jewish massacre was underway in Poland.
Now established in this country. Its purpose is
Several days later, on the 17th of December 1942, the Allied representatives, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and even General de Gaulle, came to an agreement. Together they wrote a declaration which took stock of the appalling extent of the massacre. From all the occupied countries, Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe, in Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse. The number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in many hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent men, women, and children. The above-mentioned governments and the French National Committee condemn, in the strongest possible terms, this bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. Those responsible for these crimes shall not escape retribution, and to press on with the necessary practical measures to this end.
Governments wanted to convince people who were concerned that they were doing something about the mass killings, particularly of Jews. But anti-Semitism was also strong in both countries, and no government official wanted to give the impression that the Allied governments were more concerned about the killings of Jews than they were about winning the war as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Therefore, the Allies failed to move beyond the stage of declaration. In order for them to finally deliberate on an intervention, it would take months and appeals for help from informers, particularly an appeal from one of them who was witnessing the acceleration of the massacre from within and who was risking his life to alert them. This man was the Polish infiltrator Witold Pilecki, who for almost 2 years now had been enduring a hellish existence in Auschwitz. From inside the camp, he had witnessed the material installation of the final solution. The Nazis had taken a step forward in the industrialization of death. They had extended Auschwitz and built a second camp, Birkenau. 4 gas chamber and furnace compounds were now fully functional.
Nulle part ailleurs qu'à Auschwitz, on a eu cette rationalisation de l'assassinat.
In 1943, Pilecki saw every day the arrival of trains packed with Jews from all over Europe. Those judged unfit to work were sent directly to the gas chambers. The Germans killed up to 4,000 people a day.
Że jakieś całe transporty szły do likwidacji. Domagał się reakcji także aliantów żądających, żeby próbowali przeciwstawić.
Pilecki, it has to be said, went to great pains to transmit these messages to the Allies, mainly thanks to the Polish workers who were employed at the camp but didn't live inside it. The resistance fighter just couldn't understand why nobody was reacting.
Londyn spał, żeby chociaż powiedzieli, poczekajcie, może jeszcze z pół roku czy rok, poczekajcie, przygotujemy się. Ani słowa, ani żadnej odpowiedzi, nic.
Pilecki could no longer cope with this lack of response. He'd even started to question whether his messages were actually reaching the Allies. So he decided that he would escape himself and deliver the message himself.
Ja muszę dotrzeć do Warszawy, żeby zobaczyć, co się dzieje. Dlaczego nie można odbić obozu.
To escape, Pilecki put together an ingenious plan. With fellow prisoners, he managed to get himself employed in the bakery reserved for Germans. It was located 2 kilometers away from the camp. On the night of Easter Monday, 26th of April 1943, while many SS officers were on leave, Witold Pilecki and 2 other accomplices at the bakery made the most of a less vigilant surveillance.
W nocy, właściwie już 27 kwietnia, bo było dobrze po północy, kiedy przygotowany chleb szedł do pieca, wtedy był krótki odpoczynek dla więźniów, wtedy właśnie wachmani zajęci jakimiś swoimi rzeczami i korzystając z takiej okazji 3 więźniowie próbowali wydostać się na zewnątrz.
Within minutes, they had cut the alarm wires and unscrewed the iron bar which guarded the door.
Po otwarciu właśnie tych zardzewiałych drzwi wolność była przed nimi. Wolność niebezpieczna jeszcze, bo niosąca różne możliwości, ale w każdym razie już to było to miejsce za drutami.
After 947 days of detention, Pilecki was free. In this photograph, he's posing between his 2 runaway accomplices. He looks painfully thin, but he's all smiles. He had finally got out of the hell of Auschwitz, and now he was fixed on one goal, revealing what he had seen.
O straszliwym ludobójstwie, żeby za wszelką cenę coś zrobić z tym obozem, odbić go w sytuacji, kiedy jeszcze żyją ludzie. Bo eksterminacja taka była ogromna, że właściwie tysiące osób ginęło dziennie.
Back in Warsaw, he began writing a report on his 2.5 years of captivity. The 20-page report is known as Witold's Report. We obtained a copy of it and have here translated it for the first time. In these 20 pages, without knowing the ins and outs of the Nazi project, Pilecki describes with precision what he was told, but also what he saw with his own eyes. Entire passages describe in particular the ploy used by the Nazis to avoid the panic of the women being taken to their death. They give them some soap and a towel, and they think they're going for a shower. Sometimes they don't even bother pretending. A window in the roof opens and the gas pours in. Pilecki also provides information about the huge capacity of the crematory ovens. We estimated that on the basis of 2 shifts, with 2 bodies cremated per station, this would allow you to burn more or less 5 million bodies per year in 2 crematory ovens. Pilecki sent his report to the resistance in Warsaw, who then forwarded it to the Polish government in exile in London.
Cały ten raport władze w Warszawie uznały, że trzeba przekazać do Londynu i został przekazany władzom brytyjskim. Władze brytyjskie zażądały informacji o obozie, planu obozu.
Witold's report therefore joined all the other elements received by the Allies, and it confirmed that the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis was real. Several months later, in the spring of 1944, the idea of an intervention to prevent, or at least slow down, the massacre was finally taking shape. Certain Jewish organizations suggested that, in order to halt the further arrival of Holocaust trains, the Allies bombard the tracks leading to the camps. However, this option was quickly set aside.
It made no sense to ask the military to bomb the rail lines because the Germans were easily repairing rail damage. They were repairing rail line damage within a day, sometimes within hours. You couldn't ask pilots to fly a dangerous mission that had no real effect.
A second option was more appealing to the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. It involved destroying the very heart of the mechanism by dropping bombs directly on the gas chambers and crematory ovens.
There is a memorandum that Churchill wrote that says to the Secretary of War for Air that get anything out of the Air Force you can and invoke me if necessary. So Churchill spoke in principle in favor of doing it.
Despite Churchill's backing, the bombardment of Auschwitz was never really considered as a viable option by the Allied forces. The first reason for this was simple. At the time, military means were cruelly lacking in precision.
The term precision bombing is a contradiction. Sometimes the bombs hit miles away. If you didn't hit the gas chambers and crematoria, you simply kill prisoners and you don't achieve any result.
More than 100,000 prisoners were in barracks right adjacent to the crematoria complexes. So the potential for massacring the prisoners and not hitting the crematoria was significant.
However, there was above all another reason. In actual fact, the Allies had made their choice months before. The camps were far from being a priority.
This was really the official line saying the best thing we can do is concentrate all of our effort on winning the war. That way we will save the most lives.
Yet in the spring of 1944, Allied planes did travel to the south of Poland and strike German factories only 5 kilometers from Auschwitz. It was, therefore, materially and humanly possible to strike the gas chambers of the death camp. Today, some historians believe that bombarding the camps would have enabled lives to be saved.
We can imagine that they would have saved tens of thousands of people.
Even if only 100 people would have been saved, maybe the effort should have been made.
The worst was that it was during the final months of the war that the rate of extermination was at its highest. Between May and July 1944, in just 3 months, 420,000 Jews were gassed. When the Red Army liberated the first Polish camps, it took stock of the scale of the massacre. In 5 years, millions of men and women were killed. 6 million Jews were exterminated. The Allies knew, but did nothing to stop the Nazi death machine. Whilst behind the scenes, men took the most incredible risks so that the world would learn what was happening in the camps. These were men whose lives would be forever devastated. After opposing the Nazis, the Polish resistant fighter Witold Pilecki would, after the war, be faced with a new enemy, the communist power established by the Soviets in Poland. After being arrested and judged an opponent to the regime, Witold Pilecki was killed by firing squad in May 1948. As for Eduard Schulte, he was forced to flee Germany in 1943. The Nazis had discovered that he was a secret informer for the Allies. He moved to Switzerland, where he married his mistress, Doris. He died in Zurich in January 1966, aged 75. The two men are heroes. They were men ready to go to any length in order for truth to prevail.